My name is Jenna Kipp, and I'm the Protected Places Assessment Coordinator at Ontario Nature. I've been involved in Canada's Protected Areas project for roughly a year now and have been working with municipalities and conservation authorities to have their conservation efforts recognized at a federal level. I'd also like to introduce to you the other speakers on this call. Our Director of Conservation and Education, who has been fearlessly advocating for the protection and conservation of biodiversity in Ontario for decades, Dr. Ann Bell, as well as my wonderful colleague that this work could not have been completed without, Sarah Hasenack, our Conservation Planning Coordinator. Today, we will be discussing the vital role that municipalities play in achieving Canada's Protected Areas target. But before we jump into that, we'll be providing some background context on Canada's biodiversity targets and the importance of protected areas. Following this background, we will discuss the opportunity for municipalities to champion and support this work and what would be involved in doing so. Then Sarah will be taking us through a few case studies of the municipalities that Ontario Nature has worked with to highlight the best policies and practices that protect biodiversity in an urban setting. There will then be an opportunity for discussion through breakout rooms, in which an Ontario Nature staff member will moderate conversations around the potential barriers or support that your municipality would need to engage in protecting biodiversity at a local level. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to add them in the chat as we go along, and we'll address them at the end. Finally, we have a survey attached at the end of the presentation, and we would truly appreciate a few minutes of your time to fill this in. The information gathered will help us better understand municipal perspectives on Canada's Protected Areas target, as well as better understand the interest and capacity of municipalities to contribute to achieving the target. We have two quick polling questions to help us better understand our audience today, and they should be coming up on the screen shortly. Yep, there they are. So the first question is, who are you? Are you a municipal staff, elected official, interested community member? If you don't fall into one of these categories, please feel free to address your role in the chat. I'll just give it a minute. Oh, 100% have already answered. So it looks like the majority are municipal staff, coming in at 60%, followed by other. I know we have a lot of other interested NGOs and government staff on this call as well. And then there is, here we go. I think that second question should be up now. Oh, let's see, launch. And this question is, how aware are you of Canada's 30 by 30 protected areas target? Have your municipality engaged in this target and are very familiar? Do you not know what the target is, but still have a little more to learn? Or have you never heard of it before? Okay, another great distribution here. We have 25% of viewers are very familiar with this target. It's roughly 50% that are somewhat familiar and 28% that are not familiar at all, which is great to hear because that's what we're here to talk to you about today. Okay, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Ann Bell, who will be going over project background and the important context of protected areas.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Jenna, for changing the slide there. Hold on. All right, well, I'm going to start with a bit of context, just so that we keep in mind the two monumental and interconnected crises that we're facing in our communities: climate change and biodiversity loss, because that's the context through which we can make sense of the entire presentation today. I think people generally seem to be more aware of climate change, no doubt because they feel more directly impacted or threatened by some of the adverse impacts of climate change, like extreme weather events, flooding, and so on. Less obvious to most people is that we're also in the throes of an accelerating and unprecedented biodiversity crisis, with 1 million species globally now facing extinction. Of course, the COP15 event in Montreal in December helped to raise awareness somewhat of the biodiversity crisis. Next slide, please, Jenna. At COP15, as I'm sure you know, nations around the world came together once again to sign a landmark agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It sets out 4 goals and 23 targets to halt the loss of biodiversity and restore natural ecosystems. The targets address many things, including land management, environmental contaminants, harmful subsidies, food waste, overconsumption, and more. So the parties to the agreements have many obligations, and as well, they have many ways to take action to help address the biodiversity crisis. The timeline for achieving the targets is 2030. Next slide, please. Among the targets is target number 3, also known as 30 by 30. It expresses the commitment to protect at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. Recognition of Indigenous rights and territories is central to the target, and also embedded in the target is the need to ensure that land uses in protected areas are consistent with the desired conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. No doubt, 30 by 30 is an incredibly ambitious target, but honestly, 30% is the absolute minimum that we need to attain if we have any hope of halting and reversing biodiversity loss. Currently, we're at 13.8% of Canada protected and less than 11% of Ontario protected. So we've got a long way to go. As you can see on the map here, Southern Ontario is in particularly bad shape. Next slide, please. Southern Ontario, as I'm sure you know, is the most biodiverse part of the province with many rare, threatened, and endangered plants, animals, and habitats. But at the same time, it's the most heavily populated and the most heavily developed part of the province, and it's also mostly in private hands. So that means that there are a lot of competing land uses that municipalities have to deal with. Southern Ontario requires a different approach to protection, different from in the north, one that focuses on an interconnected network of core protected areas and corridors between them. Opportunities to advance that particular approach are set out in the report that you see here on the slide, produced by the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition in 2021. The coalition is a collaborative effort involving many partners with a focus on the Greater Golden Horseshoe, but the opportunities that are discussed in this report would apply across Ontario's developed landscape, and I highly recommend that you take a look. Next slide, please. Given the urgency of the crisis, we desperately need municipal leaders. We cannot achieve the 30 by 30 target or meet our biodiversity commitments without the support and the contributions of municipalities. And the good news is that many municipalities are already stepping up to the plate, and many of them have been for decades. Sarah will be highlighting some of the best practice examples later in the presentation. Next slide, please. Generally speaking, here's where municipalities can make a significant contribution to biodiversity conservation. First of all, speak up and express support for the 30 by 30 target. Publicly acknowledge its importance and its urgency. This was done, for example, by the 80 or so municipalities that make up the Montreal metropolitan community during the COP15 conference. Besides pledging support for the target, these municipalities committed to acquiring more conservation lands, to creating a network of metropolitan parks, and reforesting areas along rivers and adjacent to woodlands. Second, commitments to contribute to the protected areas target need to be embedded in municipal plans and policies. Now, I want to be clear that this does not have to mean committing to protecting at least 30% of the lands and waters in your communities. That's simply not possible for many, if not most municipalities, as I think we all realize. Rather, this is about contributing, as our best practice examples later on will make very clear. Many, if not most municipalities could commit to making a contribution and take meaningful steps towards honoring that commitment. Third, Some of your municipal conservation lands might already meet the federal standard for protected and conserved areas, but they just haven't yet been recognized. Ontario Nature's been partnering with many municipalities that fall into that category. Suffice to say, if you have lands dedicated to conserving nature, then an important opportunity is to have them assessed. And what exactly that involves will be discussed by Jenna in a moment. And finally, lands that don't meet the federal standard, whether they do or they don't, if they don't, you can still up your game. And by that, I mean updating, enhancing your policies, your bylaws, and your management approaches so that biodiversity outcomes will be achieved. And remember, in municipalities where near urban nature is at a premium, the opportunity will typically lie more in quality than in quantity. You might not be able to protect anything close to 30% in your municipality, but what you do protect will really matter from a biodiversity perspective. Next slide, please. So why would a municipality be interested in contributing to the 30 by 30 target? Well, first and foremost, we're talking about a meaningful opportunity to take action to address both the climate and biodiversity crises at one and the same time. You may have heard the term nature-based climate solution. Conserving natural areas in your communities is one such solution that addresses both crises at the same time. Your forests and wetlands are critical for carbon storage and for enhancing resilience to adverse climate impacts such as flooding and drought. So they should be protected for those reasons as well as for biodiversity. Second, and closely related to the climate benefits, there are significant economic benefits arising from maintaining and restoring a resilient landscape. For example, according to a study cited by Ontario's Special Advisor in Flooding, maintaining wetlands can reduce flood damages and costs by 29% in rural areas and by 38% in urban areas. So that's significant. In fact, according to a study commissioned by the province, the benefits provided by wetlands in Southern Ontario alone each year are conservatively estimated to be worth over $51 billion per year. Third, and most obviously, your efforts would contribute to the broader national effort to achieve the target. And I suspect that that would matter to a lot of people in your community. Fourth, it's an opportunity to be a leader and a model for other municipalities. It's about inspiring positive change, and you can be part of the solution. Again, I think this is something that would matter to the people in your community. Fifth, having clear commitments in plans and policies and having municipal lands added to the federal database will help to generate a sense of pride and responsibility among municipal staff, decision makers, and within the community. And that will leave you in a better place to move forward rather than backwards on conservation and protection. And finally, if you demonstrate your commitment to and your success in conserving natural areas, you'll be in a better position to get your conservation efforts funded, whether that be land acquisition, monitoring, inventories, studies, assessments, and so on. You'll be in a better position. And now that's it from me, and I will pass the presentation back over to Jenna, who will discuss what lands can count towards the 30 by 30 target. Jenna?
Great, thank you so much for that overview, Anne. So what exactly can count towards the 30 by 30 target? There are two main categories that conservation land can fall into, either a protected area or an other effective conservation measure, which is frequently referred to as an OECM. The difference between these two classifications is the primary purpose of the area. Protected areas must have conservation as their main objective. They might be the conservation areas of conservation authorities, land trust properties, or municipally owned parks and conservation areas. Quite a few conservation authorities have already had their lands assessed to count towards the target as protected areas. Some commonly known examples are Wainfleet Bog, owned and managed by the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, and Glen Haffey Conservation Area, run by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Land trusts, since their goals are to conserve natural areas, can also assess their sites as protected areas. Since their assessment, all of Ontario's 26 properties now count towards the target. The first municipality to contribute towards the federal target in Ontario was the City of London, which had 11 sites assessed. These sites were designated as environmentally significant areas on the municipal level and provincially significant wetlands, or areas of natural and scientific interest on the provincial level. Alone, the provincial designations aren't enough to qualify, but together with the added layers of municipal policies, these sites can count. More and more municipalities are now having some of their properties assessed towards the target, but the recognition of municipally owned conservation lands is far from complete. While protected areas must have a primary conservation objective, this is not the case for OECMs. OECMs may be managed for different objectives, such as recreation or research, but must deliver effective conservation of biodiversity while meeting the other primary objectives of the site. A great example of an OECM in Ontario is the Queen's University Biological Station. It was established for research, but it meets the required criteria to conserve biodiversity, so it counts towards the federal protected areas target. A few other sites now recognized as OECMs in Ontario include Scanlon Creek Conservation Area, the Warsaw Caves, and the special management zones within Northumberland County Forest. In order to qualify as a protected area or an OECM, the sites must meet the following criteria. The area must have clearly defined boundaries, effective means to control negative impacts on biodiversity, long-term protection, and it must be managed by the governing authority, be it a municipality, conservation authority, a land trust, a university, or any other landowner, so that conservation outcomes are achieved. Firstly, the area must have clearly defined boundaries to be submitted for an assessment. Having the property officially demarcated in GIS is a must, as the boundaries need to be submitted to a geographic database for tracking. Other factors that enhance this criterion include the presence of on-the-ground boundaries, such as signage, fencing, trail markings, roads, or public maps. The second criteria are effective means to conserve biodiversity. It must be demonstrated that there are effective means to control all activities likely to negatively impact biodiversity, such as a development or an unauthorized use of an area. Upper tier municipalities set broader policies following provincial guidelines, such as the Provincial Policy Statement, Greenbelt Plan, or the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan, and lower tier municipalities set local zoning, which may have stricter guidelines around protection. Wording within official plans, land use strategies, bylaws, and provincial policies are often drawn on as evidence to prove this criterion. There must also be policy or planning direction that motivates the landowner to protect these areas to ensure that no activities incompatible with the conservation of biodiversity occur and that the area is protected for the long term. This criterion is normally assessed by looking at the overarching direction and objectives for natural heritage systems in official plans, objectives within strategic plans, or citywide environmental strategies. It must be for the long term, year-round, and difficult to reverse. This criterion is typically assessed by looking at how long a particular site has been managed for conservation and the overall intent of applicable management plans and policies. Policies and plans change, but in many cases, reversal of all protective mechanisms is difficult. The difficulty of changing the protective mechanisms can also support this criterion. For example, if the level of authority required to change the protection policies must go to municipal council vote, it would likely be difficult to reverse as it would be subject to public scrutiny. Similarly, if the change required public consultation, it would also be more difficult to reverse. Finally, the last criterion that must be met is that site is managed by the governing authority so that the conservation outcomes are achieved. Designated sites that are owned by a municipality or conservation authority need to have management strategies and plans in place that reflect appropriate public input and planning processes. To demonstrate that the municipality or other governing authority is meeting a biodiversity conservation goal, evidence from biological inventories, citizen science observations, site-specific management plans, or natural heritage system studies are often of use. Watershed monitoring reports issued by conservation authorities can also provide evidence in some situations where overlapping studies occur on designated natural heritage lands. During our breakout sessions later, we would be very interested in hearing from you about any implications for your management of municipal conservation lands that may arise from the recent law and policy changes, such as Bill 23. Throughout the past year of working on assessments, we've learned that there are many key challenges at play for Southern Ontario municipalities wishing to have their lands assessed and counted towards Canada's protected areas. Firstly, gathering all the necessary documents and compiling an assessment can be quite time-consuming and may not be an option for municipalities that have limited staff capacity to take this on. Second, not all municipalities are solely owned by the municipality, not all municipal lands are solely owned by the municipality. For any site to be considered, all landowners must consent to having their lands assessed and counted, and they must be committed to the long-term protection of the site, which can create complications when there are multiple landowners and managers involved. For example, Ontario Nature has previously worked with the City of Toronto to assess their conservation lands, which included areas that are co-owned and managed by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, as well as the city. Doing so requires both landowners' consent for the lands to be counted towards the federal target. And now, while that's very simple to receive consent from two parties, many occasions where conservation lands or systems are owned by many more groups, which can complicate the process. Municipalities may also have conflicting interests for how their land should be managed. Some municipalities are looking for opportunities to expand development, and so priorities would need to be sorted out. Some municipalities lack strong environmental protection policies that would make their conservation lands suitable for consideration. For example, they may be challenged to demonstrate that the long-term intent is to manage these lands for conservation. In such cases, the policy would need to be strengthened. Despite these challenges, we've worked with several Southern Ontario municipalities to successfully screen their conservations. We welcome you to provide further input on the barriers and challenges that are presented for your municipality within the follow-up survey, as well as in the breakout rooms, so that we have a more in-depth understanding of how we're able to support this work at a local level. I'll now be passing this off to Sarah to discuss some of the best policies and practices.
Thank you, Jenna, and hello, everyone. As Jenna said, I'm going to take some time now to talk about 5 municipalities who we have worked with at Ontario Nature over the years to help submit lands to the federal target. For each municipality, I'll show a map to highlight which properties were assessed, and then I'll discuss some of the strongest elements from that submission that contribute to the effective protection and conservation of the submitted properties. And we'll just keep in mind here that in the interest of time, I'm not getting into every great detail of each submission, just some of the unique elements and highlights. So I'll begin now with the Northumberland County Forest, which Jenna mentioned earlier. Ontario Nature worked with the county and the province to identify areas of the county forest that could qualify for the target. And together we decided to submit the special management zones of the forest, which are areas identified and protected for special biodiversity or ecosystem values. These properties successfully counted towards the target as OECMs, or those other effective area-based conservation measures, and contributed over 400 hectares. As Jenna also mentioned, one of the key criteria to contribute lands to the federal target is having policies and legislation in place to protect those lands from incompatible activities for the long term. Northumberland County protects its most valuable woodlots in a couple of ways. First, the Regional Official Plan identifies and designates provincially significant wetlands and areas of natural and scientific interest as environmental protection areas. Official plan policies largely limit permitted uses in environmental protection areas to reforestation and regeneration, and the conservation of water, soil, wildlife, and other natural resources. This embeds an intention to protect these natural features into the county's broadest land use planning policy document. The County Forest Management Plan also provides more specific guidance regarding the management of county forest tracts. Within this document, each special management zone is assigned a primary management goal based on the type of ecosystem present or regenerating on the land. Specific restrictions, to the types of activities that are permitted there, and additional management considerations relevant to maintaining or restoring ecosystem quality at that site. Each special management zone is managed differently according to its specific nature, but many of these areas only permit existing trails and passive recreational uses, while others will prohibit recreation altogether. Northumberland County also establishes clear goals to protect and enhance natural heritage features in many of their policies and planning strategies, including their official plan, the strategic plan, and the county forest management plan. This shows that they're consistently considering and prioritizing the conservation of key natural areas in their policies and decision-making. And lastly, I will highlight that the county has demonstrated a commitment to environmental best practice by attaining Forest Stewardship Council certification of their county forest. This ensures that where commercial logging is allowed outside of the more strongly protected special management zones, the county is managing these activities to minimize impacts on the environment, and that they're doing so well enough to meet the standards for certification. Our next example is the City of Kitchener. So Ontario Nature also collaborated on this submission with the city and the province. And together we identified 20 natural area parks owned by the city that were sufficiently protected and high enough in quality to count towards the federal target. These properties successfully contributed over 500 hectares to the target. Like with Northumberland and all the examples I'll be talking about, the City of Kitchener has established strong protection, for certain natural areas through various means. Their natural heritage system policies within the official plan call for the protection of a wide range of natural features, including provincially and locally significant wetlands, valleys and valley features, and woodlands, environmentally sensitive policy areas, significant habitat for endangered and threatened species, fish habitat, natural hazard lands, and floodways. These policies are supported and implemented through the city's zoning bylaw, which establishes a natural heritage conservation zone where new development is prohibited except for conservation uses. There are also 3 tiers of open space zoning established within the zoning bylaw with different permitted uses, which allows the city to set aside some open space lands for conservation through that natural heritage conservation zone. And those ones would be eligible to submit towards a target, while there are other open spaces that are still available for more or less intensive recreation or other uses. This tiered approach to categorizing natural and open space land for different uses is also apparent in the Kitchener Park Strategic Plan and in their official plan, which designates certain parks as natural area parks, specifically managed for the long-term protection of natural areas. All parks that count towards the federal target are natural area parks. And then there are the other park classifications, which prioritize different types and intensities of recreation and different sized service areas, but those would not count towards the federal target. And that just allows the city to manage different parks for different priorities, with only the most protected parks being eligible towards the target. Kitchener has consistently considered and prioritized conservation in relevant policies and planning documents, including their official plan, the park strategic plan, and strategic plan for the environment. And the city also prioritizes sustainable development practices in their growth management strategy and cycling and trails master plan, which helps reduce the impact of adjacent land uses on natural areas. And the city has also been designated as a Bee City of Canada for their pollinator conservation initiatives. Lastly, Kitchener has conducted site-specific studies at 12 of the 20 submitted properties to document the state of each park and develop site-specific management plans that allow the city to manage each park most efficiently according to its specific conditions. This means there are site-specific reports documenting exactly what kind and quality of biodiversity is present and corresponding plans to manage the specific risks that each site faces. Moving on now to talk about the City of Toronto. You can see here on the map that 10 parks owned by the city and or the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority have been counted towards the federal target, a submission that Ontario Nature supported in 2021. And these parks are all largely defined as environmentally significant areas and encompass over 850 hectares of land and freshwater area. The purple areas now shown on the map show another 11 parks encompassing 530 hectares of land, which Jenna and I have been working on with the City, Conservation Authority, and the province to submit towards the target as well. So we're still waiting for the results from the 2022 submissions to be announced, but these areas are primarily protected by the same policies as the 10 parks that were already accepted, so we're optimistic about the outcome. The City of Toronto implements several reinforcing policies and bylaws to protect submitted natural areas. So the official plan prohibits development except for trails, conservation, and flood and erosion control projects in areas with environmentally significant characteristics. And development is broadly prohibited in provincially significant wetlands, significant endangered and threatened species habitat, and fish habitat. The city's zoning bylaw implements these official plan policies through the open space natural zone, which prohibits all development except for compatible recreational, cultural, and educational uses, conservation, and public transit, public works, and utilities for which no reasonable alternatives are available. All permitted development projects of any kind are also required to minimize their impacts on the natural environment as much as possible. Toronto even goes a step further with its bylaw protections, as they've established a ravine and natural feature protection bylaw to further regulate changes to vegetation in ravines and other natural areas in both public and private ownership. The city has a long history of acquiring natural lands, and several of the properties submitted to the federal target have been publicly owned since the mid-1900s. Once in city ownership, these properties are managed by staff according to several city plans and management strategies that prioritize the conservation of biodiversity and natural areas, including the Strategic Forest Management Plan, the Biodiversity Strategy, the Parkland Strategy, and the Ravine Strategy. And finally, city staff have long organized and conducted natural area monitoring and management efforts. That includes 40 years of identifying and protecting environmentally significant areas, which is a big component of the submission, and 20 years of invasive species management. The city supplements their own activities through creating partnerships with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and more recently, the University of Toronto. And these extensive efforts really help ensure that the biodiversity in these areas is well documented and understood so that it can be managed to best protect and enhance natural values. Next will be the City of Brampton, who is submitting an impression. Let's start over. Next is the City of Brampton, who will be submitting an impressive portion of their natural heritage system, which is owned by the city and parts owned by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And the total area measures over 1,900 hectares. So Jenna and I have been working with the city and the Conservation Authority for several months now to prepare an assessment of these lands, which will be reviewed by the province this year. And if the assessment proceeds as we expect, the lands should be accepted to count towards the target in the 2023 update. Protections for these natural areas are established in Brampton's official plan and zoning bylaw and supported by extensive environmental planning documents. The current official plan strictly prohibits development within provincially significant wetlands and in the habitat of endangered and threatened species and fish habitat, except in accordance with provincial and federal legislation. It also prohibits new development within valley lands and watercourse corridors, except for trails, conservation, and related facilities. Environmentally sensitive areas are also largely protected from development, except for a limited list of permitted uses. And furthermore, the city is in the process of updating their official plan, and that draft plan is increasing the city's natural heritage protections, which is a really great trend to see. The zoning bylaw currently limits permitted uses most significantly within floodplain zones, largely aligning with the submitted lands, which follow along some of the city's major rivers. The current official plan also requires that all valley lands and watercourse corridors are transferred to the city in satisfactory condition as part of the development approval process. If features are not in satisfactory condition, it is the developer who's responsible for restoring them to an acceptable state before the transfer. And these transfers really increase protection of those features by establishing them in public ownership. In addition to the official plan and zoning bylaw, the City of Brampton protects and manages natural features through numerous conservation-oriented bylaws and management strategies, including the Woodlot Conservation Bylaw, Tree Preservation Bylaw, Grow Green Environmental Master Plan, the Natural Heritage and Environmental Management Strategy, the Brampton Eco Park Strategy, and the Urban Forest Management Plan. Many of these plans emphasize conservation as well as connectivity among natural areas, which in addition to that mandatory transfer of valley lands and watercourse corridors to city ownership, contributes to the high degree of connectivity among submitted lands, which was quite clearly visible, I think, on the map from the previous slide. Lastly, the city is strategically restoring large sections of the natural heritage system with help from their partners at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, Credit Valley Conservation, and Ontario Streams. Restoration activities are prioritized and informed by the Valley and Parks Naturalization Program, and soon also by the Natural Heritage Restoration Plan, which is currently in development. This work helps to maintain the quality of natural areas that are unavoidably impacted by the surrounding built environment and frequent visitors. The last example I'm going to highlight today is the city of Guelph, which Jenna and I have also worked with over the past several months to submit over 250 hectares of city-owned natural areas to the target. Like with Brampton, I'll just emphasize again that this submission is still in progress, but we do hope and expect that these lands will successfully count towards the federal target in the 2023 update. The city of Guelph has some particularly stellar official plan policies and zoning that contribute to the protection of these natural areas. An updated official plan was just adopted in 2022, and its policies largely prohibit development throughout the natural heritage system, except for legal existing uses, passive recreation, low impact scientific or educational activities, forest, fish and wildlife management, conservation, and restoration. This policy will be supported by the updated zoning bylaw once it's approved, which will establish a natural heritage system zoning category where new development is prohibited except for conservation uses. In the meantime, the existing zoning bylaw contains wetland, conservation land, and floodway zoning categories, which all significantly limit permitted developments. The most protective of these zones is the wetland zone, which prohibits all land uses except wetland conservation, flood control, conservation authority approved trails, and wildlife management. The official plan and both the current and proposed zoning bylaws establish strong actionable policies against development in the natural heritage system, ensuring that these natural areas remain on the landscape long term. The city of Guelph also consistently integrates commitments to conserve and enhance the natural heritage system into their citywide management plans and strategies, including their community plan, strategic plan, natural heritage action plan, urban forest management plan, parks plan, and their trails plan. The city's commitment to integrating conservation and biodiversity into their decision-making is also shown through their certification as both a Bee City of Canada and a bird-friendly city. Guelph's commitment to identifying and recognizing the value of their natural areas is demonstrated in their early adoption of the Natural Assets Inventory, which will in time be integrated into their broader asset management plan. This is in addition to existing natural area inventories and commitments to develop long-term natural heritage system monitoring plans. And finally, the city effectively manages invasive species, especially the impacts of the emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer invasions are managed by removing hazardous trees, leaving some of the logs from those removals and other dead woody debris in the forest to support natural forest structure, and helping to renaturalize some of the most heavily impacted areas. Managing invasive species and other risks is critical to maintaining healthy ecosystems in an urban environment, and Guelph is doing a really great job in that regard. So these 5 municipalities have helped contribute a fairly sizable amount of conservation lands to the 30 by 30 target. As you can see, 1,874 hectares have officially been accepted towards the federal target, with another 2,729 hectares in various stages of being assessed and submitted. And that's just from the 5 examples we've discussed today. These contributions from municipalities are especially important in Southern Ontario, where we saw federally recognized conservation lands are really lacking. And that's not to say, again, that those conservation lands and efforts aren't being made or don't exist. They're just not quite counted yet. And overall, we hope that these examples are just providing some ideas of what's possible for municipalities who want to establish strong protection and management of their natural areas and who may be interested in supporting the 30 by 30 target. On this slide, we summarize some of the trends and best practices we've observed from the examples. First, many of these municipalities incorporate tiers of open space and other zoning categories or parkland classifications, allowing them to identify certain lands for conservation, which can then be submitted to the federal target, while permitting some more intensive land uses or recreational uses in other areas. What is critical, though, is that the land submitted towards a target must have policies and bylaws in place to prohibit uses that are incompatible with biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. Several municipalities have also implemented bylaws in addition to their zoning bylaw that limit permitted activities and site alteration in natural areas. Parks bylaws also help to regulate visitor behavior in public parks and natural areas to minimize environmental impacts. Establishing a mechanism to acquire natural areas is also important if your city wants to submit lands towards a target, with Brampton providing an exceptional example of how this can be done through the development approval process. Of course, other parkland acquisition strategies that use municipal funds to purchase lands are also effective. It's just kind of an interesting example to see what Brampton has done. All the municipalities who we feature today also consistently prioritize conserving and enhancing natural areas in multiple planning documents and management strategies, while many have also pursued additional environmental initiatives and certifications. And this is really important to demonstrating that conservation is consistently prioritized in decision-making processes. And finally, one really great strategy to support biodiversity monitoring is to establish partnerships with organizations like local conservation authorities or educational institutions to support these efforts. This could be especially useful for municipalities who may be struggling to create staff capacity for regular natural area monitoring, which is important for demonstrating the biodiversity and ecological value of land submitted to the target. So I just have one more slide here where I really want to emphasize the importance of establishing protections for natural areas in your zoning bylaws. This is your mechanism to legally implement official plan policies. So ensuring that those protective policies for natural areas are represented in one or more zoning category is really important if your municipality wants to have lands qualify for the federal target. And on that note, I will pass back to Jenna to organize our breakout rooms.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful overview. We're now going to go into the breakout rooms for the next 15 minutes or so to discuss the 3 questions on the screen, which will also be copied into the chat for the breakout rooms. Each room will have an Ontario to help moderate these questions and to take notes on the important information that will be shared. We'll stop the recording session now so that no content during the breakout rooms will be recorded.